though, um, you can leave it just the way it is. So my name's Brad. I'm one of the librarians here at your Ruby Sisson Library. I've got a few questions for Dennis a little bit later, and we're certainly going to open up the floor to allow all of you to ask any questions that you wish or none at all. But to start with, I'd like to just introduce Mr. Dennis Medina. He is the author of, and he's going to talk about this in a moment, a book called The Madness of the Brave. And if you've received the invite for this, you've probably already read my brief introduction about some of his academic credentials and some of the publications that he's written for. So maybe if he wants, he can briefly mention any of those highlights. But more than anything, we're just really lucky and blessed here in the Pagosa area to have so many wonderful local authors who are not only talented, but they're passionate about writing. And so we're very, very lucky to have them. So please welcome Dennis, and I'm going to turn the time over to him.
Okay. Well, as Fred said, my name is Dennis. I think I know the people I can see here, so I don't think I really need to introduce myself. I only write fiction currently. A lot of my career was writing catalog copy as well as marketing materials. And what I wanted to talk about today is something that I find in my writing is really important to me, and that is how you use place to do other things besides just put you in the story. I don't know if any of you know John Gardner. He was a pretty moderately well-known novelist, not considered a great novelist, but he was considered a really great teacher. And one of his exercises was to have people take people to a group of his classes, or I should say his class, to a certain place, have them all close their eyes for a couple of minutes and open their eyes and then write a description of what they've seen. And that, needless to say, if you've ever done that with a family member or anything like that, people describe the same place in many different ways. And so what you can do as a result of that is you can sort of, I don't want to say manipulate the reader, but you can it helps ease the reader into the story. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just talk about some of those basic things. I'm honestly not a big fan of literary criticism or comparative literature because I don't think writers really put a whole bunch of things in there intentionally. I think it just happens as part of the process of writing the material. Place is really important to me personally because I identify with a place, and most of my life I chose a place, not a job. I went to a place and then found a job versus get a job and then go to, be forced to move to a place. So what I'll do is I'll talk about the main things that can be done to enhance a scene and make it better for the reader. All of this is to really draw the reader into the scene so you feel like you're there. And one thing that I know a number of people have said about my writing is that a lot of the locales are foreign places and they do feel like they're there. And I think when you do that, it helps you identify with the character, the way the character sees the scene or senses what happens around them very much says something about who that character is. So in my book, and I'm not going to plug this too hard, but in my book, I have some cases where I describe the same scene in different places by different people. And just to show that's in a way to show how this person feels about a place versus someone else. And you can also do a lot with mood in a scene, as well as the characterization. And I think that when you pick specific details, you find that it gives the reader a lot of insight into the character. So what I was intending to do is not talk a whole lot because this is much more interesting if people ask questions. But I do have a few passages from a few different writers that I admire, and I wanted to read those. They'll probably take a minute or two each, And I haven't decided yet whether or not I'm going to sort of preload and tell you this is what this scene is supposed to do. But I'll sort of give you the setting or the setup or where the story is at. And then maybe you can get a sense of what I'm trying to convey or what the writer is trying to convey rather than me telling you about it. And the first one is a book called All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy. I don't know how many people have read the book. A lot of people have seen the movie. And this is a young man who has basically, and it's the opening scene of the book. The young man has just gone to visit his grandfather, whose ranch he was hoping to get that he's not going to get as the story progresses. So I'm going to read that to you. And I think one of the things I'd like you to sort of, if you want to pay attention to anything in particular, is notice the use of what I would call a lot of funereal words. You know, like he talks about lilies, and there's a lot of black, a lot of gray, a lot of cold. And it's just about a page or two. The candle flame and the image of the candle flame caught in the pier glass twisted and righted when he entered the hall, and again when he shut the door. He took off his hat and came slowly forward. The floorboards creaked under his boots. In his black suit, he stood in the dark glass where the lilies leaned so palely from their wasted cut glass vase. Along the cold hallway behind him hung the portraits of forebears, only dimly known to him, all framed in glass and dimly lit above the narrow wainscoting. He looked down at the guttered candle stub. He pressed his thumbprint in the warm wax pooled on the oak veneer. Lastly, he looked at the face, so caved and drawn among the folds of funeral cloth, the yellowed mustache, the eyelids paper thin. That was not sleeping. That was not sleeping. It was dark outside and cold and no wind. In the distance, a calf bawled. He stood with his hat in his hand. You never combed your hair that way in your life, he said. Inside the house, there was no sound save the ticking of the mantel clock in the front room. He went out and shut the door. Dark and cold and no wind and a thin gray reef beginning along the eastern rim of the world. He walked out on the prairie and stood holding his hat like some supplicant to the darkness over them all, and he stood there for a long time. As he turned to go, he heard the train. He stopped and waited for it. He could feel it under his feet. It came boring out of the east like some ribald satellite of the coming sun, howling and bellowing in the distance, and the long light of the headlamp running through the tangled mesquite brakes and creating out of the night the endless fence line down the dead straight right of way and sucking it back again, wire and post, mile on mile into the darkness, after where the boiler smoke disbanded slowly along the faint new horizon, and the sound came lagging, and he stood still, holding his hat in his hand in the passing brown shutter, watching it till it was gone. Then he turned and went back to the house. So this is the young man he's gone, and he was, as the story progresses, you learn that he's gotten very close to was very close to his grandfather, yet now he feels as if he's been sort of abandoned. And I don't know if you got any of that sort of darkness and sadness of that story and what happens to him, but that's a very moving passage for me to read. Not to read, but to read not aloud, but just to read to myself. And Cormac McCarthy is one of my favorite authors. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take them now. Like I said, I don't want to go back and tell you how many times he said dark and black and cold. But it gives you sort of almost like you're standing in a big department store refrigerator. That's kind of how I feel when I read that. So, any question?
I have a quick question, unless somebody else wants to jump in first. And I've muted you, so if you want to ask a question, raise your hand if I don't see you. If not, I'll go ahead with mine real quick. So Cormac McCarthy is obviously a master storyteller. He's a really great author. Um, and so he's really good at giving these descriptions that you just mentioned that help convey a message. But um, as an author, I wonder if you could give some insight into how difficult it is for uh, a regular author or even a master author like Cormac McCarthy. Um, how do they know how to give just enough detail and descriptive verbiage without giving too much?
Yeah.
You know, I guess I'm my father's son, so if I were an author, I would be giving way too much detail and like miss the mark. But I've always been fascinated by that, and I'm just wondering if you have any
Well,
thoughts.
yeah, for me as a writer, the way that I describe scenes is I write really tight third person point of view, and I'm not sure that everybody understands point of view, but it's basically where the story is coming from and who's telling the story, or through whose eyes and other senses the story is brought to you. So what I find is, first of all, I'm really a minimalist as a writer. If I have any questions, I think it was what's his name, Elmore Leonard, one time said, if you ever are questioning something about that you have written, that means you should be throwing it out. And I had another one of my mentors who told me one time that if you're really struggling with a passage, frequently it means it's not supposed to be there. But in picking out detail, it's, again, if I go back to John Gardner, who I probably haven't read in 35 years or something like that, you go back to John Gardner and you close your eyes. Actually, let me go back a step here. I don't know how any people who've read Thomas Wolfe. He wrote a book called Look Homeward, Angel, and a number of other, and he just sort of slathered on the description. And I got lost in the middle of his descriptions. And especially since we live in a place or live in a time where it seems people's attention spans are fairly short. If you give them too much detail, you lose them in the middle of the scene, and they lose the picture. So it's sort of, for me, the way that I try to do it is I imagine that I'm the character, and then I don't close my eyes and open them again and see this, but I do at least, not literally anyway, but it's certainly figuratively, I think about what this character would see. And the character, when, I'm looking past the computer screen now, and there's a bookcase behind it, and it's just loaded with books. Well, the thing I'm noticing is there's a little dragon on the front. I could probably, well, firstly, it really bores me to write a whole bunch of long description. And so when I'm picking detail, and I'm not so sure that I pick the detail, but when the detail is coming out, it's more what do I feel about this place? What is it about? What does the character feel about this place? And those are the things that pop up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a really good answer. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions before I go on to the next one, which is much happier scene. So the next one is another one of my favorite books. The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway, which I personally think is his best book. I think he wrote about 2 or 3 good books, and then he wrote a bunch of stuff that he was writing so he could write like Ernest Hemingway wrote. But this is, I don't know who's read this book, but this book is set in Spain. It's set, now I should probably go back as well and say All the Pretty Horses, I think it's set in about the 1950s. And a lot of what Cormac McCarthy wrote about, a lot of that theme was the dying of the Old West. In that series of books that he wrote called Crossing was one of the other ones. At any rate, it's a trilogy, and I forget the name of all 3 of the books. Anyway, it's about the death of the cowboy, so to speak. Hemingway this was written in the 20s. And a lot of this book it's written from the point of view of a character named Jake. And Jake has had a messy relationship. He was wounded in the war. He's got a really messy relationship. And he's been talking up to page 90 or something about going to Spain, because that's his big thing. He's going to Spain for the bullfights. I think we were talking about that today, Linda. Anyway, Jake has finally gotten out of Paris. He's traveling with another two guys, and they're about to enter Spain. So they just basically rented a car. Didn't rent a car. They have a chauffeur who's going to drive them into Spain from, I think, Bayonne, if I remember correctly. And they've just crossed the border, and this is how Jake sees this part of Spain that he's going to. And for him, this is about exuberance is what I get out of this description. Again, Hemingway is really good at writing very lean description. The chauffeur came out folding up the paper. Oh, sorry, I don't need to read that. We all got in the car and it started up the white, dusty road into Spain. For a while, the country was much as it had been. Then climbing all the time, we crossed the top of a col, the road winding back and forth on itself. And then it was really Spain. There were long brown mountains and a few pines and far off forests of beech trees on some of the mountainside. The road went along the summit of the col and then dropped down, and the driver had to honk and slow up and turn out to avoid running into two donkeys that were sleeping in the road. We came down out of the mountains and through an oak forest, and there were white cattle grazing in the forest. Down below, there were grassy plains and clear streams, and then we crossed the stream and went through a gloomy little village and started to climb again. We climbed up and crossed another high col and turned along it, and the road ran down to the right, and we saw the whole new range of mountains off to the south, all brown and baked looking and furrowed in strange shapes. After a while, we came out of the mountains. There were trees along both sides of the road, and a stream and ripe fields of grain, and the road went on, very white and straight ahead, and lifted to a little rise, and off on the left was a hill with an old castle with buildings close around it, and a field of grain going right up to the walls and shifting in the wind. I was up in front with the driver, and I turned around. Robert Cohn was asleep, but Bill looked and nodded his head. Then we crossed a wide plain, and there was a big river off on the right, shining in the sun from between those line of trees. And away off you could see the plateau of Pamplona rising out of the plain, and the walls of the city, and the great brown cathedral, and the broken skyline of the other churches. In the back of the plateau were mountains, and everywhere you looked, there were other mountains, and ahead the road stretched out white across the plain going to Pamplona. And in this particular scene, I mean, I think for me anyway, that's a really nice picture, a beautiful picture. And you said mountains a whole lot of times, but maybe because I've been to Spain, I could see this. I read this book before I ever went to Spain, and you just get a sense of what the place is. Gloomy villages, the brightness, the sun, and the sort of sun ripening fields. So that's that one. And I think it also captures where Jake is at. He sort of finally escaped his sort of not dreary life, but very, very limited life that he's been living in Paris. And this is his big vacation. So. Anyone have any questions?
I have another question, but anybody else want to go first? I don't want to steal everyone's thunder.
And certainly, if anybody requires clarification, that would be great.
Hang on, Linda has a question. Linda, if you can hear us, you should have an unmute button. You might have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we
can.
can.
You hear me?
Thank you.
Okay, great. You know, I was thinking about, as you were reading the passages, Dennis, you know, those passages I think do help sort of give you that background feeling or tone or whatever. But when I think about novels that are very memorable, or scenes within novels that are very memorable to me, it's usually not that part of it that stays with me over time. It's usually something that happens, some sort of, and maybe that's what you were talking about, it sets that emotional tone of the narration or the action, so that you can remember then that connection between the people or the emotional state of the main character, or something that's going to happen that seems to be you know, part of the storyline or the plot, that, or even sometimes what a main character might say. You know, those kinds of things stay with me. The background or the descriptive detail of the setting may be important to get there, but I don't remember it. You know,
Right.
as I'm,
Yeah, I think it's a very valid, you're making a very valid point. I mean, I'm reading these pieces out of context, and I think that I believe that, like, this scene here very much leads us to this interaction that takes place in Pamplona, and you certainly know how Jake, the main character, feels about Spain when I read this. Is it the most it's memorable to me because I love good descriptive landscape writing, but it does fit into that model that we have, or that I believe that good writers have, in that everything contributes to this whole picture that's getting drawn. Make sense? Most people, I think.
yeah, and I think that's the selection that the author makes.
Yeah. Certainly action has a much more memorable effect upon people. But what you know, my sort of thing about place is that if you set the scene correctly, I'm trying not to lose my train of thought here. If you set the scene correctly, or well, I should say, because it's not really correct. If you set the scene well through your descriptive detail, then you feel like the reader will feel like they are part of that scene. And if you're really doing it well, they'll feel like they're part of that character. And that's where that whole identity of identifying with characters comes from. Because all of these things sort of fit. They're not individual pieces. You know, I'm talking about it as an individual piece. But the fact is that it all fits into the story. And Brad asked earlier, how do you decide what to put in and what not to put in? Well, you only put in things that contribute to where the story is going. So, like I said, I'm a real scenic kind of guy, and in my writing reflects that. I mean, I read some people whom I really like, and for example, I thought, geez, I brought three male writers here. I probably should have brought a woman writer. I really like to read Annie Tyler, and I don't know other people who if other people read her, and she doesn't really write much description at all. But boy, you sure can't identify with his characters. But I think that if you are writing scene, you want the scene to sort of contribute to the characterization.
So the Hemingway piece had a descriptive scene of Spain. How important, or is it not important?
Well, and that when you remember it, or as you follow along, you are visualizing this character in this place somehow.
I'm sorry, I think we stepped over each other. I will be quiet if you re-ask your question or statement. Sorry about that. I'm not sure who is speaking. Oh, well. I apologize if I cut you off. Let me know if you want to try to restate that. But how important is it for an author to have been to the place that they're describing? Or is it not important at all?
No, I think it is important. I don't think it's imperative. I think that in my writing, in my book, my book's pretty scenic, in places, certainly in places, and I haven't been to all of those places that I wrote about. For example, some of the book is set in the Syrian desert, and I've never been to Syria. And what I did is I've been to Algeria, and I sort of picked things out of Algeria that struck me, and used those, as well as, Google allows you to do all sorts of stuff because you can get pictures of things.
Yeah.
When I was writing about New York, I lived in New York for a short time, but I'd kind of forgotten a lot of those places, or the place that I'd been. And so I went and looked at pictures of New York, street scenes of New York, and that's how I picked out the stuff that I thought my character would see.
May I ask real quickly, have you ever been to Vermont? Were you
Yes,
Vermont?
to live there.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I could sort of sense that was, I could sort of sense that the description just wasn't made up, that you had a more personal connection to that.
Yeah, it's actually, the house belonged to a friend of mine that I used in the description.
Wow.
So I usually try to go to places, or I should say, I usually write about places that I've been, but if in a story, being in a terrorist camp in Syria comes up, I have to figure out, I'm not going to go there, to see it, but I can make it up, People have said to me, how do you know so much about the CIA? And I said, I made most of it up, I mean, I read some books about it, but, imagination, that's what writing's about.
So imagination is certainly important, but I wonder how much research, and this is a novel, the Madness of the Brave that you wrote, but how much research went into that? You did mention a little bit, you can look up New York City, you can kind of recapture the visuals, but did you do any other in-depth research?
I did a moderate amount of research on the FBI because of the FBI character, and I know nobody in the FBI. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. I went to school with a kid whose father was an FBI agent, but that's probably the most I knew. And the Becchetti character is actually based on a guy named Lucius Conine, who was. So I mean, I sort of steal. Yeah, I steal that stuff. I don't plagiarize, but I steal that stuff. But to be really honest, I didn't do exhaustive research on those kinds of things. I think I read a couple of books on the FBI, and I'm kind of a little bit of a news junkie, so I follow stuff pretty closely. Yeah. And the reason that I wrote the book that I wrote is because that period in art history was really continued to be intriguing to me.
Thank you. One other quick question, then I'll be quiet for a while. I wonder how many people here, or if you, Dennis, have read any of the Winston Graham books. These are the Poldark books. If you watch PBS, you can watch Poldark. My wife got me hooked on Poldark. It's great, but the books are really good too. And one thing about the books is perhaps they're a little excessive, and they with our short attention spans, it's hard to really focus, but they've got these really, really great descriptive scenes that make you feel like you're in England, the coastal Cornwall region of England. And they're just really, really great landscape scenes. So if any of you are at all interested in reading more about that, maybe I would recommend trying one of the Poldark books by Winston Graham. It's almost fun to read these because the scenery is a prominent character in the novels, and for a purpose. It's not just there, it's there for a purpose, but I was just wondering if anybody else had read him.
Well, I think when you talk about excessive description, certainly one of the people who always comes to my mind is Tom Clancy. I remember reading Hunt for Red October and literally turning 50 pages at a time to get onto the story. And so I think writers write what they like.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know some people who think that, you know, 20 pages on how it's the screw on a submarine turns is just really gets them going, you know. Personally, it doesn't get me going at all. So, you know, taste has so much to do with it. And I think that not, I think that writers like me is the way, probably best way to say it, is you write about stuff that interests you, you know. And I think when people say, "Oh, you're a writer, what do you write?" I say, "Well, I write about things I'm trying to figure out." You know, when I wrote my book, I couldn't understand where these characters came from, but by the end, I did. So there, I got it. You know, I did. I sort of accomplished what I wanted to accomplish for myself. So. Any other questions before I go on to the best section of all?
Yeah, I had a question. Is there a problem with describing a very familiar place? You know, when I read your book, you know, there were places I didn't know anything about. And so if you don't describe it right, I have to take your word for it. But
Yeah.
when you describe something that's really familiar, like New York City to some people, I know that the comment that people get is that would never happen in New York City, or that's impossible for that place. Is there a problem with describing too much of a familiar place?
I think that in New York's probably a really good example because almost everybody has a different idea of what New York is like. When I wrote about New York, I wrote about places in New York that I knew, and then I also looked at the pictures, so I remembered what I'd seen. So I haven't had anybody say to me, "Oh, that's not right. That street isn't there." But you know, right? They use that old, you know, a willing suspension of disbelief. You have to go into writing with that. And if you're going to have somebody say, "Oh, you know, that's not really how what that sign said," you know, sometimes you just have to make this stuff up. I mean, most of the places that I wrote about, I didn't have any difficulty I didn't have any difficulty thinking about the place. Sometimes I had difficulty seeing it the way the character saw the place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Avalon had a question too.
Yeah, I'm wondering, is there a difference in the level of description in novels versus nonfiction, you know, like memoir writing, things like that? Would it make a difference, or is it about the same?
Well, I would think, you know, I'm going to wing the answer, okay? So you should know that because I can't say yes or no to that. But I would think again, it depends on the writer. I think memoirs are much more interested in writing about their experience, their personal experience, and so maybe, you know, descriptive detail doesn't have as nearly the impact. It's not nearly as critical as I think it is in a novel. I mean, I've read some great novels that have virtually, you know, really no real description, but the characters are wonderful and their thoughts are wonderful and the ideas they're trying to portray are wonderful. It's just, you know, my bag is I like stuff that has good descriptive writing, and there's not a lot of that around. I mean, you can tell by the people I'm reading here that these, you know, two of these guys have a big reputation, great reputation as wonderful stylists. Hemingway certainly is sort of out of favor at the moment, but he still, you know, he was a great stylist. You know, Cormac McCarthy is I think is one of the finest stylists writing in the English language right now. And the interesting thing about him is if you've read his books, his writing has gotten leaner and leaner and leaner over the years. If you read his early books, they're kind of real traditional, you know, books that were written with a lot of words, and then you go and look at something like The Road, and it's, you know, it's almost like a deity speaking, it seems at times. So I don't know if that made any sense, but it popped into my head, so I said it. So
Yeah, thank you.
sure. So I don't know, because I don't read a lot of memoirs, so I can't say, but there is a lot of memoir being written right now. It's one of the, as far as I know, one of the more popular genres out there. And everybody in their brother has a story to tell. So the last piece I'm going to read is from The Madness of the Brave. And this is the beginning, so I don't really have to explain very much about what it's about. But I'm trying to capture waiting, what you feel like when you've been sent somewhere and you're waiting. And this is in New York. It's actually the first chapter, but there's a prologue before it, written it from a different point of view. And this is written from a woman's point of view. And again, it is a place that I know. So Gary, I can tell you that, yeah, I know this place, but fortunately not a whole lot of other people know it because it was Barbara in my bedroom in New York. So Carla lay on the, okay, so this is the first chapter, and there are two characters. I shouldn't have to tell you anything because it's the first chapter. Anyway, Carla lay on the mattress, Sam asleep beside her. The city heat close, palpable. Air conditions hummed in the air shaft beyond the burglar's gate and locked window. Thunder rumbled in the distance. From somewhere in the building came a sharp scream. Of pain, she wondered, or of pleasure? She could no longer say for sure. 2 weeks cooped up in an apartment house in New York had dulled her senses, and she hated the waiting, unable to relax, hovering just above sleep, dozing but never dreaming. Carla rolled onto her side and took a deep breath, exhaled deliberately. The window was dirty, she noticed, smudged, the light outside gray, listless. Another day, she thought, as she let her eyes wander from the window across the drab white walls. They lingered for a moment on a spot near the door, pale where the plaster had been patched. Then she tossed again, the clammy sheet sticking to her bare, wet skin, and lifted her head and rolled her long blonde hair up and off her neck and lay upon it like a pillow. It was the empty time before the action, Carla knew, purgatory, and she accepted her mood without question, without qualm, as she did her presence here. Their mattress lay on the bedroom floor. Cooler there, Sam told her before he went to sleep. The top of the sheet was tucked neatly at his waist, and his belly rose gently with each breath. The desert had left him lean and taut, had turned his skin tea brown. Droplets of sweat lay gathered along his upper lip, and Carla wanted to lick them off, to touch him, to feel his naked body against her own. But she didn't disturb Sam. Instead, she wiped her fingers on the sodden sheet, and when she did, the air didn't move. She envied Sam his sleep. His military service in Vietnam left him impervious to the jungle heat. The thought made Carla smile. New York City, the cultural center of the universe, and the climate was primitive. The wet heat was as much to blame for her restlessness as was the waiting she knew. In the dry air of the Hamad, she was content to wait and came to love the quiet time between operations. Without effort, she let her mind drift back to those times, to late afternoons in Saba Yar, when she would climb the rise behind the camp and sit cross-legged on the desert ridgetop. She remembered the heat all around, remembered staring into the distance, waiting for the landscape to come alive, remembered the breeze rustling through the brush, through her cotton blouse, remembered the distance, the dampness between her breasts, and the quiet, so quiet. So that's actually somewhat of a transitional scene because we go into a flashback. So hopefully you sense that the mood had changed as the mood of the scene and the tone of the scene changed in just over a series of paragraphs from one of listlessness and waiting to the place where she really wants to be, which is in the Syrian desert. Questions? And you can certainly ask about sort of anything else if you want to. We don't have to just talk about this topic. So.
One other quick question, and you already mentioned two really, really great authors that you liked. I wonder if John le Carre or Robert Ludlum influenced you at all in specifically The Madness and the Brave, or if you like or don't like those two authors?
I really like Jean Le Carré. I like his earlier stuff rather than his later stuff, primarily because he's gotten very, very, what's the word I'm searching for? Polemical. His anger about government, is, you know, the establishment and government is very, very. I thought got too strong, got a little bit overwrought in his most recent books. The government is all bad. I mean, one of the themes in my book is, yeah, government is bad, but so are the leftists are bad too, and so it's more about, to me, it's about people, and it's, you know, there's a line in there where one of the characters comes to the conclusion that really the left and the right are the same thing. They're all interested in power. I don't like Ludlum because I think his characters aren't real people. And I would say certainly I read John Le Carré on, I mean, I read some books like 30 or 40 times over, you know. I think like you know, I've probably read most of Cormac McCarthy's books at least a half a dozen times. And probably Hemingway I've probably read 30 times. And my actually all-time favorite writer is a guy named Robert Stone, who wrote a book called The Dog Soldiers. I bet I read Dog Soldiers 50 times. It's just a really, for my taste, you know, and I always sort of qualify when I talk about other people's writing and my own, I always qualify it with the fact that my taste is this, and I really like that. Some other people go nuts over fantasy. I have a son who loves fantasy. He's always sending me fantasy books, and I can't get like more than 3 or 4 pages into it, because that's just not the kind of thing I like to read. And there are so many good books to read. Why read stuff you don't want to, or you don't like?
Thank you. Very insightful. As a librarian, I will just say, everybody will have their own taste, and it's okay to read whatever you want or to not read whatever you want.
Yeah. I know with my book, some people find it very frightening, because one of my good friends says, this guy's a psychopath. And I said, no, he's not a psychopath, he's a sociopath. And he's a character who, frankly, when I wrote him, it was like, where did that come from? You know, because I'm a pretty intuitive writer. I don't sit down and plot like crazy. Early on, I had an early draft of the book, and one person said to me, this character has to die at the end, and I wasn't planning on that, but it happened. Just it sort of, I hate the word organically, but it just did. The book progressed. I don't storyboard or anything like that. I just put people together and see where they take me.
And isn't that what life is, right? You know, our lives aren't storyboarded out, so.
Yeah, and you know, some people, that's just how they write it, you know. And I have a good friend who I think is quite a good writer. When I tell him all the characters, it just come from within me, and I don't know where they come from, you know. More than that, he says, that's a bunch of bunk, you know. You know, that's all that's Misto stuff. But anyway, you know, different writers also have different styles, different methodologies, and things like that. So.
And you touched earlier on when the story takes place. Was it difficult for you to decide that this book, The Madness and the Brave, or any piece of writing takes place in a specific period of time? Or I guess I should say, did that come up after that you thought of the characters, or did you know from the outset that it would take place when it does?
Well, I wanted to write about terrorists, and I mean, that's what intrigued me, is how do people get from being, I wanted to write about good terrorists, let's put it that way. And the fact that you know, the world is not black and white, and it's very gray, and I know that some people, there's a character in the book who's an assassin, and he's a sort of a heartless kind of guy, but he's a really nice person, I think. And so what I wanted to do is I didn't want to write about a sympathetic terrorist. I just wanted to write about how do good people go get to that kind of place, and which is what I was trying to figure out, which is what sort of spurred me to read the book, because I mean, I sort of grew up in that period. I was a young adult in that period where, you know, the shiny path were running around, and the Bader Meinhof people were running around, and you know, those were not bad people. Yeah, there were some bad people among them, but a lot of those people were well-meaning. And so, how do you get there? You know, how do you make that transition from being, you know, well-meaning to a heartless killer? You know, and so, which I found really interesting, and I think my character is actually reasonably sympathetic considering the fact that they kill people. But that's sort of, Andrew is a different character. He's a character that scared me the most. Because I'm working on something now. I was talking to Linda. I think I was talking to Linda about it today. And I kind of figured out why I wanted to write this book that I'm working on now. And I think a lot of it is that anybody is capable of doing anything if the right buttons are pushed. And it can become anything. So. More questions? Any questions?
So while everyone thinks, I'll make another quick plug for the book. It's at the library. You can come and check it out. But where can someone purchase your book if they feel so inclined?
You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it on Barnes and Noble. You can buy it in town here at Bookend. To be completely greedy about it, the best way, as far as I'm concerned, you can buy it directly from me, and I actually make some money off it. So, I mean, you know, it's kind of obscene how much money Amazon makes off of books and how much the writers get. So. But that's okay. I didn't write the book to make money, so. And I can assure you I haven't. So.
If you buy it from Dennis, you can get it autographed.
Yeah, if you buy it from me, I'll sign it for you. And you can buy it on the website, or else you can just send me a note at dpmedina.com, and we can figure out how I can get it to you. It's $15, and and I won't charge for shipping, especially if I can just drop it off somewhere. Although these COVID times, maybe I don't want to do that. I'll just ship it to you. So. But there is a place you can go and buy it through on the website at dpmedina.com. You can also go and read the first couple of chapters there. It's on the website. So.
Yeah, I got it on Kindle.
Yeah, it's on Kindle. I frankly, most of the time when I sell books, I sell them at book shows, book fairs, you know, writers' conferences. It makes you feel good because you actually sell some books versus being 3 millionth on the list at Amazon or wherever you might be. And the hard thing about selling books I'll get a little bit mercantile here. Hard thing about selling books on Amazon is there's so darn many of them. You know, I think Amazon says they have 8 million books or something. What's interesting, you might like to know, because you might like to know, I found it really interesting, so I'll tell you this. Amazon doesn't really stock books. I mean, yeah, they'll stock, you know, Michelle Obama's book, they'll have 50,000 copies on the shelf. But, you know, because of technology, if you order a book, if you ordered my book on Amazon, you could get it faster than I can get it from my publisher. Because they just place the order with the printer, and the printer ships it to you. So Amazon has nothing to do with it except take the money. So. And I thought that they actually sat there with books on their shelf. They don't really.
So I have one more question, and maybe this is for the whole group and not just for Dennis, but do you think that someone could be a good writer if they don't feel emotions strongly, or they have a hard time wrestling with their own emotions? In other words, how important is emotional awareness to the ability to write, especially a novel.
I'll let the people answer that first. I mean, I can certainly comment on that, but maybe if other people answer first, we'll get more people to talk about it. So.
Well, I mean, I would say that, yes, you have to have access to your emotions and understand what motivates you and be reflective about what you do and why you do it, to write about it and have some understanding of why other people do the things they do, to write it from another point of view, because I think that's really hard to understand another person's motivations or impulses or drives that lead to certain types of behaviors. I think that takes real personal reflection in order to write about it in a way that's interesting to other people, that they can then relate to it. But yeah, I don't think that you could be a fiction writer. You can be a technical writer. You know, you can write reports. You can do a lot of that, scientific writing, that sort of thing. But I don't think you could write fiction about human growth, human connections, human drama without really understanding feelings and particularly your own.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll, that's one of the things that I'm struggling with in a way. I'm writing a memoir, as you may have guessed, and but I'm used to doing more technical writing and research writing and fact-based, you know, presenting fact-based kind of information. But in a memoir, I find myself having to go back and forth from, you know, here's the background on what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about in part of my book about my experiences using hypnotherapy to access subconscious memories and material and so forth. And so it goes back and forth from, well, you know, having to describe, well, what is hypnosis? What's the history of that? How does it actually work? What's that about? And then, but always coming also back to my personal experience in which there needs to be a real shift in tone. And there is a real shift in tone, but part of what I'm getting from this conversation is that I really do need to put more emphasis on, you know, how does something make me feel? Even like the setting or the place, like you were talking about, Dennis, you know, how does it make you feel to be in a place? So it's not just the physical description of what it looks like, what it smells like, but bringing those feelings in more and more. So this is really useful information for me because I've never written a book before. And so I'm kind of a novice in that area. But yeah, the whole thing of, I know that even when I'm listening to a lecture, or if I'm delivering a lecture, there's a whole shift in tone from when I talk about a theory and then all of a sudden talk about, and here's an experience of mine. It's like a personal experience. It's like all of a sudden the room wakes up, you know, because people are really engaged by storytelling, you know, even much more than you know, just facts and history and things like that. So that back and forth thing is kind of an interesting process, and I'm not quite sure how to navigate that, but working on it.
Thanks.
Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
Yeah. I'll just put in something in response to, I'm sorry, I can't see the person who just spoke on my screen here, but I had an aunt who was one of the sort of early leading lights of the feminist movement. She wrote a memoir, and I know the thing that her editor was constantly telling her was, open up. You just have to, you have to pull it out of yourself. Otherwise, it's not interesting to people. I think that really good writers have empathy because they understand other people, and that's how those other characters come out. I think more, as much as anything, that probably the primary thing, if you don't have a lot of empathy, if you understand drama, you can write novels. And not drama and empathy are, causing conflict and resolution is what drama is about. And although, you know, for me anyway, I don't think about that stuff. You know, I mean, I know it, but I don't think about it per se. And early on, you said, Brad, you said, well, maybe you could give a little bit of your background. I didn't really talk about my educational credentials, but I do have a master's in fine arts. And you know, one of the things I say jokingly is it took me 5 years to forget what I'd learned. But what I really meant is it took me 5 years where I internalized it and I didn't think about it anymore. You know, because I don't really think about any of that stuff. So, I mean, maybe after the fact I do, I go, oh, that's really cool. Where did that come from? That's exactly the right word, you know. But I think you know, if you want to write books that move people, not in the sense of excite them like an action movie might do, or adrenaline, you know, raise the adrenaline. You have to have an empathy because otherwise you can't understand people. You also have to be a great eavesdropper, which I really specialize in. So, you know, I really spend a lot of time listening to people talk.
What do you get from eavesdropping? What is that? Can you say more about that?
Dialogue. You get so much dialogue from people because, you know, you read a lot of people don't speak in a most people, I should say, do not speak in a very organized nor grammatical manner. And so capturing that is, you know, I would never, for me anyway, I would certainly never try to write dialect because I don't think I could do it. But dialogue, you know, people don't make sense a lot of times when they're talking. I mean, the words don't make sense, although you know what they're saying. And also, I think you learn a lot about characterization about people when you listen to them talk and how they speak with one another. I'm trying to think of some examples, you know, I mean, you know, I think some people think my wife and I don't like each other because if we go to a restaurant, which we haven't done in almost a year now, we don't talk very much. We're just both sitting there listening to people. And people are really fun to listen to because people are really funny in general, you know, in a sort of sometimes a twisted, skewed sort of way. So I think, you know, eavesdropping is a really good thing. So I don't know how I got there, but that's typical of the way I speak. So.
Well, when you're talking with someone that you know really well and have had a very long relationship with, you also talk in very shorthandy ways because you have this shared history that you know what you mean.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when I'm talking like with Jim or somebody else, and I realize if somebody heard us saying this, they would think we were absolutely insane because but you understand sort of what the connections are and you don't have to say it. And then these words absolutely don't make any sense at all. But we understand you know, what the message is.
And you can write that message too if you understand if you listen to it the right way. And it also will again say something about those, you know, Jim and Linda talking to each other. There's a lot there. The fact that you talk to each other in shorthand that you can pick up in writing a story about that. I'm sorry, I might train of thought in the middle of that.
Well, it seems like you'd have to find a way to also, I mean, when people are talking, there's facial expressions, hand expressions, there's the inflection of the voice. Whereas when you're doing it with the written word, I guess you'd have to find some way to communicate that because there's it seems to me that there'd just be such a big difference between the written word and actually listening to someone.
Well, you know, if that's something that I pay a lot, I shouldn't say, I've spent a lot of time thinking about is, you know, they'll tell you don't use adverbs, you know, Joe says something, you know, intensely. Well, you know, that intensely shouldn't be there. That's kind of cheating writing. You should, because when you write dialogue, you're not transcribing what someone has said. What you're doing is you're capturing the essence of what they've said and how they say it. So you shouldn't have to use a lot of exclamation points if somebody's screaming. The words, good dialogue does that for you. You don't have to put a bunch of tags down, although there's some writers that I really like, and I have to sort of sit back and go, okay, this line is this person, this line is that person, this line is that person. But you can convey through the words, the words between the quotation marks. You can convey sadness, intensity, anger, go down through the range of emotions, and good dialogue does that. So, but that's really
How does it do that? How do you do that?
the words you choose. If somebody is screaming at somebody else, and I'm trying to think of a way to say this which makes some sense to me too. If you write, without giving an example, because I can't think of something off the top of my head, if you can convey emotion through through dialogue without having to tell people this is how they said it, because it fits into how the conversation is going back and forth. Does that make sense?
I think so.
But I do think it's hard to convey things like sarcasm.
Absolutely.
With the words, because you have to know the character to understand that this was really, a very sarcastic remark, and maybe the thinness, the tone of voice, or the whatever, but those things are hard to pick up with just the words alone.
Absolutely. But if you know the character and the character is portrayed well, the reader will realize that person is being sarcastic. And that's really hard to do. It's so much easier to say, Joe said sarcastically,
Right.
than it is to have the dialogue,
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm sure we could ask many more questions, and if there is any last-minute questions, please feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, I very much would like to thank Dennis for joining us this evening, and thank you all for attending. And please let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to reach out to the library if you have any needs or wants or requests. And thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you, Dennis.
If I could put in a word.
Yes.
Thank you to the folks who are out there, some of whom I don't think I can see right now. I appreciate your questions. And if you do, especially anybody who is out there trying to be a writer, if you do have questions, you can just send me a note, because I like to talk about writing a little bit when I'm not writing really seriously, but not too much, to be honest. But if you have a question, please, I think I've said what my website is, and there's a section there where it says comments, and you could just send me a note and I'll answer it, although I'm kind of slow sometimes at answering things. So. And thanks again to everybody for coming in. I hope I didn't confuse you too much. Good.
That was great.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, I'm going to end this meeting. Hope you all have a wonderful night, and hope to see you all soon.
Okay.